Please welcome to the stage Executive Vice President of Network Services, Seth Julian.
Good morning. How is everyone? Great. Welcome to the 2023 Small Business Finance Forum. It is with great pleasure that I stand before you today as we kick off the forum. Reflecting back to our first SBFF in 2012, we had 130 attendees from 40 different CDFIs, 5 funders and investors, 1 government agency, and 5 unique industry stakeholders, including consultants, associations, and industry service providers. We had a total of 8 breakout sessions and no dedicated tracks. Today, we're thrilled to see a sold-out crowd of nearly 500 people from more than 140 CDFIs, 11 different funders and investors, 5 separate federal or state agencies, and 40 unique stakeholders. This year, we have a total of 22 breakout sessions across 5 tracks, networking opportunities, new deep dive trainings, and a reception. The growth is a testament to the increased importance of CDFIs in small business finance. It's also a testament to the dedication of everyone in this room. We have an exciting lineup of learning, knowledge sharing, innovation, and fun for you. I'm particularly excited about our 3 amazing plenary sessions, including one this afternoon featuring SBA Administrator Guzman with OFN's new President and CEO, Harold Pettigrew, who you will also hear from soon. Our generous sponsors make all of this possible. Our deepest gratitude to JP Morgan Chase, our lead sponsor, and thank you as well to our supporting sponsors, U.S. Bank Impact Finance and Woodforest National Bank. As sponsors of this event, you are helping us build an even stronger CDFI industry, and of course, this event wouldn't exist without OFN's dedicated staff. Although we don't have a dedicated event team, the spirit of organizing impactful gatherings runs deep within us. The effort put into orchestrating this event is truly a labor of love, and I want to express my heartfelt appreciation to the entire team for their unwavering passion and commitment. Would all the OFN staff members please stand and be recognized? (1,463 days. That's how long it's been since our last in-person SBFF. The journey from 2019 to this moment has been long, and our country and the world has seen significant changes. Since we last gathered in person, President Biden won the 2020 election and has since put transformational attention and action towards investing in low-income communities with initiatives such as Justice 40. The Republicans took control of the House of Representatives. We've seen a greater recognition of the urgent need to address climate change and implement effective environmental policies to reduce greenhouse emissions. My beloved Baltimore Orioles went from losing 108 games in 2019 to now being poised to make the playoffs in 2023. I hope I did not just jinx them. Significant progress in the field of space exploration has captivated our imagination and pushed the boundaries of human exploration, with the Perseverance rover collecting crucial data and providing clear pictures of Mars. Technology advances have been rapid with the recent emergence of ChatGPT and generative AI. Tragically, we face the heart-wrenching murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Rayshard Brooks, which sparked nationwide protests demanding racial justice. And of course, we have all collectively navigated the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. So much has changed since 2019 in the world and at OFN. The 2019 forum featured a dynamic, energetic CDFI leader in the opening plenary. This leader, Harold Pettigrew, passionately discussed the intersection between formerly incarcerated individuals and the capacity of CDFIs to foster economic stability and opportunity for underserved populations. He was a leader of a DC-based CDFI at the time. That too has changed. Now, in a wonderful culmination, please join me in welcoming OFN's new dynamic president and CEO, maybe not so energetic since he has a young toddler now, Harold Pettigrew, to the stage.
Good morning. Oh, we got to do a little better than that. Like Seth said, I got 11 months at home, and I'm a little more energetic than that. Good morning. There we go. Good morning, folks, and welcome to Chicago. It's been great to be together with you today, to focus on an area critical to driving economic prosperity in the communities we fight day in and day out to support, but also an area near and dear to our collective passions. I'm especially honored to address you as President and CEO of OFN. It's fitting that my first industry remarks in this new role are in Chicago, at an event about small business, a focus of much of my career. Many consider this wonderful city to be, in many respects, the birthplace of our movement. It was 50 years ago here in 1973 that the first community development bank, Shore Bank, launched with a simple and bold motto: let's change the world. Shore Bank's business model married modest profitability with strong social impact. Its success changed the conventional wisdom that investing in divested, formerly redlined communities was bad business. Shore Bank is no longer with us, but join me in a round of applause because the call to change the world is alive and well in this room. Now, I was here with many of you in 2019 at OFN's last in-person Small Business Finance Forum. 1,400 plus days, Seth just counted out. And I'm pretty sure I speak for everyone saying that we had no idea of the journey that lie ahead. We were called in unimaginable ways to help our communities survive the economy shutdown. And what did we do? We stepped in ways, as we always do, during times of duress. We walked towards the crisis with our characteristic mix of compassion and empathy, rigor and expertise. We worked in our communities and with each other to keep capital flowing and help small businesses to stay afloat. At the time, I was head of WACIF, the Washington Area Community Investment Fund, a CDFI serving small businesses throughout the Washington, D.C. region. Those early and intense months were a blur of long days, urgent decisions, and new partnerships navigating a pathway forward when the path was often unclear. I know you all know what I'm talking about. Now, with the clarity that comes from time and distance, the industry's heroic work proved what we've always known, that CDFIs are an integral part of our financial system. You made sure the phones were always answered. You worked the late nights and long weekends to make sure our common cause was honored. And you did it because you know, like the entrepreneurs we support, that we have very little space for failure. Ironically, one of the century's greatest economic and social challenges made our industry even stronger. The CDFI response to the pandemic earned us growth, attention, and unprecedented new capital. International corporations like Google turned to CDFIs to support small businesses. And OFN distributed over $180 million in loans and grants to CDFIs all across the country. That's something to applaud. Together, we turned this capital into financing for more than 130,000 entrepreneurs of color and women-owned small businesses. The government also looked to us in its pandemic relief efforts. CDFIs and other community financial institutions made more than $34 billion in PPP loans, outperforming larger institutions. Another wonderful thing about our industry is how we come together. During the pandemic, we saw new and growing CDFI partnerships at the state level. In Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth partnered with the Pennsylvania CDFI network. That's right, we got Pennsylvania in the house. I heard the faint clap over there. The Commonwealth partnered with the CDFI, the Pennsylvania CDFI network, a network of 18 CDFIs to distribute $96 million in relief grants. This is to small businesses all across the state and counties. They have grown their collective efforts and today partner with the state in deploying capital through the State Small Business Credit Initiative. Locally, Axion, the Chicago Community Loan Fund, and Community Reinvestment Fund joined forces on the Chicago Small Business Resiliency Fund to get loans and grants to Chicago small businesses and nonprofits. Of course, the CDFI response to the pandemic shouldn't surprise anyone. Our industry has a long history of leaning into crisis, economic and otherwise. During the Great Recession, we kept capital flowing when traditional lenders retrenched, especially in communities of color. After Hurricanes Katrina and Ike, Sandy and Harvey, and then Irma, they came along and destroyed businesses in their path. CDFIs such as Lift Fund and Hope, New Jersey Community Capital, True Fund and Renaissance, and so many others helped small business owners in our communities to rebuild. So no, I'm not surprised at our industry's response. But I'm proud, and this is the reason why I join you today. We have so much to do together. And while the pandemic officially ended last month, our work toward an inclusive and just recovery continues. Later today, I will have the pleasure of sitting with SBA Administrator Isabella Guzman to discuss how CDFIs can help small businesses as the nation continues to emerge from the pandemic. But there's another topic I want to speak now about. And it's an urgent call to action for our ailing planet. We have proven that during the greatest times of community distress, we are financial first responders. And now we will need to come together to combat our greatest threat. Almost every day we're seeing climate change in action. We're seeing disasters in every region. Smoke from Canadian wildfires reached across the East Coast in the US earlier this month. Some areas of the country are still experiencing its impact. Horrible tornadoes have ripped through southern and Midwestern states at regular intervals. And 100-year storms are regular occurrences, causing deadly floods and horrible destruction. The fact is that our climate isn't changing. It's changed. And unsurprisingly, the communities where CDFIs operate suffer disproportionately. The industry is moving in the right direction. More than half of OFN's members offer green financing products and services. And even without a designated product, many of you are investing for people and the planet. We find examples here, again with our friends at the Chicago Community Loan Fund, who financed equipment for a net zero energy vertical farm and food business, which is an operation in an abandoned meatpacking plant. This is one of hundreds of stories of CDFIs investing in sustainable businesses. So yes, we're off to a great start, but we need to do more. OFN is making climate change and environmental justice a top priority. Environmental justice should be forevermore front and center in all of our collective work. We are supporting you in incorporating climate lending into your work with tools, training, capital, and other resources. In fact, our first climate lending 101 training is tomorrow, and it's at capacity. The next one we'll hold is at the OFN conference in October. But the biggest opportunity to jumpstart the industry's climate lending is in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. The $27 billion fund is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to accelerate the clean energy transition and ensure environmental justice for our communities. We are committed to maximizing CDFI access to these resources because we know that this extraordinary initiative will not succeed without you. It cannot succeed without CDFIs. Climate change isn't urban or rural. It's not northern or southern, coastal or inland. It's not small business or housing. It's all of these. With inaction, things will only get worse. And underinvested and low-wealth communities will bear the brunt of it. I feel the urgency more than ever as a new father. My son is almost 1 year old, and having a child has given me a deeper appreciation for the work that we do day in and day out. And each morning, when he wakes, I see in his eyes the promise that I will do everything in my power to make this world safe for him and for his future. As it is for many of you, my fight is now a different one. Not for me, but our collective future. Our children deserve a safe and clean planet. They deserve opportunity. They deserve the freedom to live their lives unencumbered by racism and discrimination or our greatest threat, an unlivable planet. The future is why we are gathered here today. It's why CDFIs exist. It's the work that we have ahead of us. Let's dive in for our communities. Let's dive in for our clients and the people that we serve. Let's dive in for future generations. I want to thank you all because often the work that we do, frankly, is thankless. What you do day in and day out to ensure, not over the last 4 years, but throughout your collective careers and histories and why you're here today, your passion of what drove you here in doing this work, it's often misunderstood. So I want to thank you all. It's truly my sincere honor and pleasure to be serving in this new capacity and working with many of you in this different role. Let's go have some fun for this forum. Let's get back together. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. We all look forward to your leadership as you guide OFN and the CDFI industry to new heights and drive our collective efforts toward a more equitable and inclusive future. Now, as we transition into our opening plenary, it is essential to underscore the vital role that CDFIs play in serving and reaching entrepreneurs of color. CDFIs were established with a mission to tackle the root causes of poverty and inequality while providing support to communities that have long been excluded from mainstream financial services. However, we must acknowledge that entrepreneurs of color still face systemic barriers and a persistent racial wealth gap. This morning's plenary, titled Disrupting the Status Quo, How CDFIs Can Lead the Way in Prioritizing Equity, encapsulates the challenges we face and the opportunity to effect meaningful change. Intentions alone do not define an institution as inherently anti-racist. While CDFIs are driven by the purpose of aligning capital with justice, it is the impact and results that truly matter. It is our collective responsibility to ensure that our actions create real, tangible change in the lives of those we serve. I am thrilled to have a wonderful panel joining us for this important discussion. We have Erica Seth Davies, Bulbul Gupta, and Joe Neri, each bringing their expertise and insights to explore the strategies and solutions needed to advance equity in our industry. So with that, please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Okay.
It is bright.
Good morning, and thank
Now you
you
woke up.
for having me this morning. When I got the email to invite me to moderate this panel, I jumped at the chance. I'm a huge fan of CDFIs. I am a huge fan of Bogle. It has been a pleasure to get to know Joe and get to know a community of people who are committed to strengthening communities through a financial services system that was not always designed to do so. And so I am Erica Seth Davies. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the founder of the Racial Equity Asset Lab and also the CEO of RIA Ventures. But most importantly, I'm here today as an advocate for this industry, this sector, this movement. And I am looking forward to being in conversation with Bogle and Joe today. So, as Seth talked about the origins of CDFIs, being a civil rights agenda actually at one end and possibly aspirational as being anti-racist at the other. And intentions being necessary but insufficient for addressing the racism and the structural inequity that's actually embedded in the financial system. Our conversation today seeks to move past what during our planning call Joe called the progressive protective bubble that's been afforded to the organizations that are operating in this space. And how do we really get to tackling challenges? What are the actual experiences of organizations that are moving towards an anti-racist agenda? And what are the tensions, but also the possibilities that are inherent in doing that work? So we're going to start just by talking about the journey, and I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves through some of the questions and responses, which I think you all will actually start to see personally how folks are embedding this, but also how that leadership is influencing organizations as well. So Bogle, we'll start with you, and then Joe, turn to you to share with us where your effort began. Where did this organizational journey begin for you? And if you want to fold in personal, please do that as well. So I'll start with you.
Thanks, Erica. Lovely to be doing this with you and to meet you. Bill Bookup, the President and CEO for Pacific Community Ventures. We're a California-based CDFI. For me, it's interesting. I think the explanation that you and Seth offered, I was really struggling with that as I was thinking about the answer to this, because I think for me, when I came into this role as CEO, first-time CEO, after 10 to 15 years in the impact investing space, I also assumed that because CDFIs were born out of the tail end of civil rights legislation, they must inherently be centering Black and brown wealth building. That's what we were created for, right? Having worked in DC on and off Capitol Hill in an administration, I was like, okay, as an impact investor, which is what PCV started as 25 years ago, we're looking at intentionality and measurement, right? So if the intent is Black and brown wealth building out of the tail end of civil rights, how are we intentionally designing for that, and how are we measuring for it? So as my managing director of lending, Bob, somewhere in the audience knows, I peppered him with questions when I took this job, and realized, wow, that actually is not safe to assume. Okay, what am I dealing with here? So I think that, for me, is really what ended up shaping a lot of that journey, is assuming that and then having the blinders taken off to realize the intent of the passage of that legislation was actually so watered down that the Black and brown wealth building focus was really vastly diminished, right? So over the last 30 years, we haven't been held to that expectation, that intent, nor have we been actually measuring those outcomes. So I guess in thinking about sort of how we redid that journey, for me, it sort of started with one of my favorite professors in grad school, C.K. Prahalad, said one thing to us in the first day of class in emerging markets. He said, how would you redesign products and services for the poor if you were to reconceive them as customers and clients, not as beneficiaries of aid? And I have spent most of my career since then addressing market failure. Why do markets fail? Where do they fail? Who do they fail? And I realized when I started taking the blinders off and Bob started reminding me of all the rules and all the parameters we are governed by, how do we redesign within that sandbox? How do we flip the narrative of inheriting terms and rates set upon us that too many of us feel like we have to deploy or implement further upon our clients? And how do we redesign that with human-centered design principles to redesign for low-income, Black and brown, Indigenous clients to recenter that mission? So that's, I mean, for me, that's really what has shaped, and I think for PCV's team, that's really what's shaped our journey, and happy to get into it more with details.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Joe.
So Joe Neary, I'm the CEO of IFF, which is Chicago-based, but Midwestern serving CDFI, mostly with nonprofit small businesses. And IFF's journey started when its CEO, yours truly, kind of stepped in it at a staff meeting. In 2017, we were getting ready to work on our 5-year strategic plan, and I was asked by a staff member in a staff meeting, how will racial equity be centered in our strategic plan? And I said, we're not ready for that. So you can imagine the response. Now, this is all pre-George Floyd's murder. But for many of my staff, it's like, well, what the hell are we doing here? So there was this moment of intent and impact for us, for IFF, and for me personally, as a leader of IFF, to really begin to think, well, what are we all doing here? So there was a lot of ensuing discussions, a lot of trust building, which we'll get back to in a second with some of these conversations. But IFF's journey began at that staff meeting to really begin to kind of peel back this ongoing conversation that I think that everybody in this room is probably having a lot in the last few years about intent and impact and what does it mean to be ready. And there's a lot behind that, right? Not a completely clueless guy. But what does it mean to get ready and to really put into practice? And so it became the foundational plank of our strategic plan, and we have been living that ever since. And it has taken us in all kinds of directions that I don't think that at the time we even knew. But what it did require was for us to ask the questions that both of you just beautifully asked, right? Which is, how do we continue to interrogate and ask the questions that bring us to what would this really look like if we were centering Black and brown communities and all of our communities? And that's how this journey began for IFF.
Okay. But stakeholders, there's so many stakeholders, right? So that's very often a challenge in being able to get on the journey and to move it forward. So can you talk just a bit about how you navigated that from the outset? Were there some corners that you didn't necessarily see around? How did you think about this in the context of borrowers, community, clients, right? As you're shifting the mindset of who you're serving, your own investors, right? So how did you think about and balance these various stakeholders to be able to maintain your focus on this journey?
You start.
I can start. So I've been very vocal about where we don't start as investors. We cannot start there. They are an incredibly important part of the puzzle. I spend an inordinate amount of time working on getting investments, but that cannot be where this industry starts, because I fundamentally believe like this industry did not start by bankers and banking. We had that, right? This started out of a different vision for how that system was failing communities. So if we go right back there, that is exactly the pernicious aspect of structural racism, that we go back to where we were failing, right? I think that this question, of course, is what so many leaders that come talk to me about is like, how do I balance all of these tensions? It's like, well, that's what makes you a leader, right? It's so easy. It's not. It is inherent into the challenge that we have to have, and I have to say white men have to really start to question themselves about building trust, but not assuming trust. And so when I stepped in it at the beginning of this whole thing in my progressive protective bubble, it pulled me out of and placed me squarely into this question around how do we begin to build trust. And you begin to build trust by acting trustworthy, and you begin to build trust by putting all of it out there and having really hard conversations. And we did that as a staff, and we worked really hard, and we created an amazing vision statement that was about IFF becoming anti-racist, and we brought it to our board, which was majority people of color, and they said, no. They said, no, we're not ready for this. And we begin again. Because this work, this journey, this hard work is like beginning to build trust. And I hadn't done that enough with the board. That was my bad. But it did build trust with staff when I said, well, this is what we have to do. How do we get you there? And we began the work again. So I think that part of balancing all of those entities is about building trust. And that's how you bring the investors along. I will say that we have amazing investors who have trusted IFF. We've worked really hard at that. And just as the energy that goes into building trust about we're always going to pay you back, because at the end of the day, that's what it really is about, right? But inherent in building that trust, you bring them along to building the trust around the impact and the vision that we absolutely want. And I will say our two biggest investors, US Bank and the Northern Trust, and I wanted to call them out because I also want to say they have been egging us on and saying, keep at it all along the journey, and other investors have come along with that as well.
Okay, thank you. All right, Boba, where did you come into the
See all this
understanding?
white hair? It mostly comes from balancing all of those stakeholders on this journey in this job the last 3.5 years. And being a mom through
Wait, has it
the
only been
pandemic.
3.5 years?
3.5 years?
Wow, okay.
Only? Yeah, it feels like yesterday. I was 5 months into this role when the pandemic began. I agree, I wouldn't start with investors, although Lisa was my first in-person investor diligence meeting at OFN 3 weeks into my job. I think it's really important to make sure you are starting on your team, because if you as an organization are not walking the walk and living the mission, you are not going to sustain building and keeping trust with this journey with any other stakeholder, nor do you deserve to. And I think that for PCV is really the deep journey we have been on, is what does it mean to be anti-racist? What does it mean to embody a civil rights mission through a financial organization? When I took this job, two of the first people I reached out to, I'd never worked in Oakland, right, which is where our office is based. Rich, rich social justice, racial justice history, the home of the Black Panther movement. I reached out to local folks who I happen to know through impact investing, including Runway's co-founder, Conda, board members, advisory members, community partners, to really make sure I was doing a listening tour of where had we as an organization and even as CDFIs failed to reach Black and brown and low-income communities. What did they want out of a future for organizations like ours and PCV specifically? so that I was just deeply listening and then reaching out to industry leaders like, I don't know if they're here, I can't see anyone, Donna Gambrell, Bill Bynum, who took the time to sort of mentor a first-time woman of color CEO, which I was really grateful for. And I think bringing that into the staff of who do we want to be, who should we be, how do we get there, and like you were saying, Joe, create the space to have uncomfortable, hard conversations that were not easy. I don't think they should have been easy. If it was easy, we wouldn't be where we are 30 years later in this industry, right? Where the black-white wealth gap in this country is exponentially worse than at the founding of our industry. So I guess I'm grateful that we've been on it. I'm really proud to have a team that is fully here for that mission at this point in our journey. But yes, I think you have to build trust internally. You have to live the mission, because then you are the ambassadors of that mission to everyone else. Clients, partners, investors, board members, and I'm grateful to have a board. I was on our board before I took this role, but I'm grateful to have a board and my newer board members as well who are really deeply committed to the mission and journey we're on.
Sure. So I had done a little bit of work, I guess, in 2020 and 2021 with some partners where we were doing just that, having to interview, and it was the Catalyzing Capital for Racial Equity project. So interviewing borrowers in the Bay Area about their experience. And you all both mentioned two things that were evident out in the community that you worked on internally, and that was trust. I think everybody thought that, one of the building blocks or one of the results of that research would be about, different products or the cost of capital, but it was about trust, and it was about a particular orientation towards working in communities that emerged from that research. And so I'm hearing you say, and you've got to do that inside, right? Like you can't have this dissonance between what you're doing in the organization, with your board, with your conversations with staff, and what's going to happen out in the world. And in so doing, you all were actually inheriting existing structures, right? Like in an industry. And one of our colleagues who was to be on the panel today, but the weather and the airline industry had other ideas, Jessica Norwood, who's the founder of Runway, was formerly the Runway Project, talked about design, intentional design, for what she calls reparative justice, which is a way of considering justice that centers those who have been harmed. It focuses on repairing past harm, stopping present harm, and preventing the reproduction of harm. And so in creating her organization, she designed that organization to provide flexible and friendly financing and business support to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color entrepreneurs. And so she could build it from the ground up to do that and think about the relationships with investors and, negotiate on terms and cost of capital from the beginning. She could think about the timing to get to closing for borrowers. And so it's different when you inherit a thing versus when you get to design a thing from the get-go. And so I would ask that question of you all, just in terms of this thing that you've inherited, or these organizations within a broader industry. Let's focus now on some of the policies, the practices that were shaped by cultural norms around lending, right? And what were some of the areas that you then had to start to focus on with respect to the core of what it is that you do, getting capital out into communities. So how have your organizations, and you as leaders, if you're comfortable talking about this, reckoned with and accounted for the racism that's built into this system, that's embedded in the system, that has generated the structural inequity and the bias against BIPOC borrowers? So who wants to go first with that? Volvo?
Sure. A couple of reflections. One, I think so I've never worked in a CDFI before. I've never been a banker before. I feel like I should disclaim that before answering this question. Although I have worked in microfinance, just not as a banker. having come from impact investing and working with like impact startups, B Corps before this role, I think I was also a little bit more familiar with not just the friends and family style capital rounds, right, early stage, but also the pace of change, right? That if you have an idea, that you're able to affect change within a startup, a growth organization, a B Corp, whatever, a little bit maybe faster than, for whatever they're worth, the rules that govern the CDFI industry. I think first and foremost, how we tackled that question was our underwriting. Again, if you are not walking the walk, the core thing of what we do is how our capital shows up, who we invest in, how we invest, and how that investment is structured intentionally to support wealth building, particularly in underestimated communities or entrepreneurs, right? So in changing lending practices, underwriting rules, et cetera, working really closely, again, Bob and I have to give Bob a lot of credit for this. Two of the biggest things we did early on is take out asking about personal assets, because we found that entrepreneurs of color tend to underreport personal assets, whether it is because they are suspicious that if a loan goes south, their assets will be seized, or because they don't perceive them as having as much worth, or both, right? You can hypothesize. So if we are not a collateral-based lender, why are we asking about personal assets? Is it really core to getting to yes? The other thing we did was go down to no minimum credit score, and that was pre-pandemic. And those two things really vastly changed our underwriting from where 3.5 years ago, so at the end of 2019, our capital was deployed to about 70% to entrepreneurs of color and women combined. And last year, at the end of 2022, we reached 92% of our capital was deployed to entrepreneurs of color and women combined, 80% of which is entrepreneurs of color. And 3 years ago, we started being one of the first CDFIs to disaggregate our data, to share race and demographically disaggregated data. So I think vastly changing our underwriting, again, after those listening sessions with community partners who felt often like CDFIs had failed their industries by acting too much like banks. So then we were like, okay, well, how do we not act like banks? To your point, we were created to intentionally fill the market failure, right, from historic bank discrimination. So how do we embody that disruptive mission we were created to fill? And so I think that really vastly started to change. The fact that we were able to get to yes with more entrepreneurs started to then build the trust, to your earlier point, with those community partners more and more, that like, okay, they didn't just come to have a talk with me and like check a box. Mm-hmm. They really actually took that talk, they went home, they did their homework, and they're showing up differently, and continuously showing up differently, continuously being able to say yes and build more of that trust, I think has vastly just changed how we show up in community with community, and co-create the financial products and services that come from, by, and with our entrepreneurs versus sort of from on high down market into low-income communities. So that's a little bit of how we started with that effort.
Joe, nuts and bolts.
So everything just said was just put so beautifully. I want to repeat those things. I think that, again, we get to this place that they're just tools. A hammer can hammer a nail, it can hurt somebody. And so what are we centering? What is that, where's that intention? And again, we have to move it to centering Black and brown communities. Then these tools actually can be powerful. But we have to understand that they exist in a context of 400 years of structural racism. So interesting enough, IFF started 35 years ago with a fundamental principle that appraisals were not going to work. It wasn't purely from a racial equity lens at that time. But it was centered in that we knew that a child care center on the west side of Chicago was just not going to appraise at what was needed to get it off the ground. So if you're going to use that tool, you're not going to make loans. And we were in the business of making loans to those nonprofit agencies, right? So from the very beginning, we knew that we had to rethink how those tools work. It's not that appraisals are inherently bad. There's got a lot of information. So we frequently say at IFF, in order to change the box, you have to know the box. And then you got to get out of the box because you're centering yourself in a different way. At that time, it was, we need childcare centers on the west side. And so we not appraisal based, we're still not today. We would make loans. And in fact, just 2 weeks ago, we were doing no appraisals up to $3 million. 2 weeks ago, my board said, let's get rid of it completely. Because we need to rethink how to be responsible with that. Now, people will say, well, what do the investors think? Again, we didn't start with investors. We started with just the money that we had from the foundation, and then the Sisters Religious, they're the people that invested in CDFIs at first because they were aligning with their mission of justice. And then the banks came along, and 35 years later, we've been good stewards of that money without appraisals. We don't do risk-based pricing. Just think about that for a second, right? And we also do 95% of loan to cost because it is very difficult for starting nonprofits in many of the communities that we work in to raise that kind of capital, to have that 20, 25, 30% down payment, right? So each one of those were interrogated and readjusted to what we could do to manage risk, and I think that we've continued to do that work now much more with the racial equity lens. What do we need? I love the word interrogate because you're asking, why isn't this tool working? How do we know that it's not working? What are the outcomes of it? And we're going to keep coming against, yes, we really do need this tool, and it's still racist. So what do we do? And that's where we got to move out of this binary yes-no. A colleague of mine on the National Community Development Committee for U.S. Bank said, we have yet to be funded. We don't have no, we have yet to be funded because every credit coming is a work in progress. And what's our responsibility to change that work in progress? And sometimes it's to rethink how this works, and other times it's like, this does work, it's very predictive, we cannot throw it out. How do we help using a whole bunch of activities that everybody in this room uses, capacity building, et cetera, to move the organization, in our case, and entrepreneurs in many of your cases, to that place to be funded, not just yet to be funded. That's the work.
But that work in getting there requires some learning and it requires some culture shift. So what were some of the, resources or approaches that you all have had to take to bring your organizations along with respect to learning so that you can understand what those tools are, how they are racist, and kind of shifting use of them? What's gone into the cultural aspects of this? What's gone into the learning so that everyone can get it, right? Like have that aha moment where they see it clearly and be like, oh, okay, got it. Let's
well, I don't know if everybody's going to see it clearly all the time, but it's, so the president of our Social Impact Accelerator, Dr. Tara Townsend, said, there is no equity work without research, evaluation, and learning work. So our equity work is in our Social Impact Accelerator because there just is not going to be this work without those other aspects. You talked about you're tracking, you're evaluating, you're reassessing, you take some steps forward, you take some steps back. So I think that everyone has to understand that if you are on this journey, your organization is also going to be on a learning organization journey. hard stop. And that is true for IFF, and it's very much a component of this strategic plan of becoming a learning organization. So I think inherently we're all risk managers, and risk managers by definition are conservative. If you don't take risk out of unknowns, you're safe. I think that we have to ask the question inherently, if we're not doing stuff, who is harmed, who benefits, and who is harmed? So for our organization culturally, we've got to constantly keep asking that question. Who benefits, who is harmed? I frequently ask, and if we don't do things, who is harmed? Who do we not know about? Why do we not know about that? And how do we learn about that? And then as risk managers, I think that we continue to use all of those tools to bring us back to experiments. So for IFF, we have changed our target market criteria. We had some. We asked the questions, we interrogated, why $500,000 minimum revenues? Well, because such and such. Why $500,000 minimum revenues? Who cares what their revenue source is? Can they repay the loan? Okay, that's out. 3 years of audited financial statements. If you've never borrowed money and you're kind of a small organization, who's spending money on an auditor? Let's rethink that. So we're going to keep interrogating and then learning from that. Out of that work, it brought us a lot of different organizations because we started started rethinking how we were marketing, because we were like, so who's not showing up at the door because of who we are and how we did business development and how we marketed? Who's missing? And when we examined that, we realized that we were missing a lot of smaller organizations, and many of those organizations deeply in communities of color. So we had to rethink that. And I'll tell you, this is another good example about, constantly challenging ourselves. I get this contract from a consulting company here led by an African-American woman. I read it and I was like, this is not going to work with our agencies. And our executive director, Vicki Lakes-Battle, gave me the look. And you know that bubble that you see in a cartoon? That bubble was like, oh, hell no, I'm not having this conversation with you. We're doing this. And I looked at her and saw the face and said, okay, we're doing this. And boy, was I wrong, right? Because I can be a learning organization too. We did the work, and in many ways, it didn't work with large organizations. It worked beautifully with small beginning organizations. And then we created a new loan product, and yes, we put all kinds of parameters around it, because this is not a binary.
Sure.
This is not binary work. We're putting parameters around it. We're experimenting. We're evaluating, and then we'll see where it goes.
Okay.
Yes. I definitely want to underscore Joe's point about always being a learning organization. I think, so one, in just starting with curiosity, interrogation, right, of the peppering I described earlier to my head of lending, who was like, you want to do cannabis, you want to do this, well, we're not allowed to do that, until it's federally decriminalized. I was like, oh man, that's a huge opportunity for black and brown wealth building that I can do as an impact investor, but I can't do as a CDFI. Oh, okay, what else can I do? How do we do this? How do we do that? So the interrogation of what are we doing well? What are we proud of? Where are we not doing well? And can we humbly approach this with no ego and genuinely just interrogate what is not working, why is it not working, where have we not built trust, where have we potentially done harm in how we showed up or how we failed? And you can't fix it until you acknowledge that and you work through it, right? At least sustainably. You won't fix it beyond a Band-Aid or a short-term Band-Aid. And so I think for us, to bring the team along on that journey, we really started a deeper, I know a lot of folks sort of call it colloquially like a DEI committee, but we started a pretty deep, it was almost 2 years long, and we try to sort of refresh it more from time to time now, a pretty deep curriculum that we took our entire staff through month to month on different topics. starting from like, what is the black-white wealth gap? Why does it exist like this? Why were CDFIs started? Going back to the 400 years of history and structural racism. What happened on Black Wall Street? Like things we don't learn about. Things you don't learn about in school for most of us. Things lots of us haven't learned in our lives. And if you don't unlearn what you think you know to then really learn anew and stay humble to constantly be learning, you are not going to be able to also fully bake that into the iterative process I think you have to have in the kind of work we are doing, which again is inherently meant to solve for market failure, right? To solve for market failure, you cannot use purely market mechanisms because that is why the failure exists. Those market mechanisms didn't work. And you have to be learning and iterating and innovating those products, services, deployment, partnerships, how you reach folks, because there is a reason they have been failed. So I think for us, vastly redoing the culture of the organization to be learning, I think I'm really proud that at this point, I feel like we have a pretty almost no ego team. I would say no ego team, but I'm sure some folks we're also working on our own individual journeys. But it is like a much more humble learning culture, which allows us to show up with community partners and entrepreneurs in a vastly different way. And I never take that for granted, right? I don't think most of us do on our team, but we can't, because the second you take that for granted, you start to be less in humble learning, iterating, innovating mode. And so I think the ability to keep learning, keep hearing that feedback, and intentionally building the feedback loop, which we've now done with both our lab that we started and our lending program, as well as our mentorship program, just to make sure they each have community feedback loops and entrepreneur feedback loops, has really, I think, changed the culture. And then lastly, I would say we moved from sort of Zoom pandemic land to a hybrid culture a couple of years ago, where we bring our staff together for full staff retreats a couple times a year. And I think while lots of you probably do that, I think one of the things, and I've started to really notice the shift in our culture since then, is from the very first staff retreat, we intentionally structure a full day or two of that retreat to be in community. We literally go around with one of our community partners or a couple of our community partners. We walk around to visit our entrepreneurs. We are in the community that we are serving. More of us represent the communities we are serving. And so just making sure we keep really grounded with who, where, why we serve, and do what we do, so that when we are back in our Zoom lands or wherever we are, it has further sort of helped more staff, I think, embody our mission than where you think you get it theoretically or intellectually. I think it has helped more folks literally embody it and carry it in the culture of the organization.
So I'm going to take a little moderator privilege and go off script just a bit from what we had talked about, because inherent in this conversation and the work that you all have done is pacing, right? So it's very easy to fall back on what's familiar, pace for privilege, what are our investors going to want to go along with this, et cetera. But at the same time, there is this urgency of now, right? Just like, how do we get this done? How do we move the ball forward? How do we get this capital deployed in a particular way? And that was on fire in 2020, right? If you weren't making statements and, out here, like, being visible, right? We'll call it performative in some places, was what started to happen. How do you think about the pacing of this work so that you kind of keep your foot on the gas, but you're not leaving folks behind, and making sure, even as leaders, that you can sustain the pace and the change and the learning, right? So, and.
This is what keeps me up at night. This and this Silicon Valley Bank nonsense. But I I think that the reason it keeps me up at night is because I've spent a lot of time doing the work, as you mentioned, about understanding our history, right? And the empire always strikes back. So I'm going to use my era's a way of talking about this, right? That structural racism is a thing, and it wears us down. So it is almost a cliche where we talk about this is going to be long work. It absolutely is. And I go back to my early days in my career. Community organizing was really centered on this work is long-term work, but if you're not constantly celebrating the short-term successes, nobody's going to join you for what this really will take. And that comes back to me all of the time in this work, because it is easier for the statements to get made, the performances done, and then for us to divert our attention, because it is very hard and it is very systemic. So I think we are having those conversations right now at IFF, and we continue to have them, and I don't have an easy answer. Mm-hmm. I know that we spend a lot of time talking about how do we create long-term goals and then break it up into pieces. Like how do you eat an elephant, right? Which is the same in business broadly, of like one bite at a time. But then how do you celebrate those, and then how do you continue to build on those, which is why it's so important becoming a learning organization, because you're never done learning. That is an ongoing journey, and how do you celebrate that? So I think I don't have a perfect answer. What I have is the intentionality of 145 people to continue to center this work and to hold each other accountable and help each other celebrate in the low times, so that we can continue to build that, just like your typical community organizing campaign where you're trying to build off each movement and eyes on the prize.
Okay. Yes, agreed. This goes back to the white hair in this job, balancing all the different stakeholders. I think about this a lot also in terms of thinking about two things. I think one, there is a perception I've heard mostly from investors and or funders or prospective funders, where there is a perception that a deeper anti-racist journey, one, inherently means your risk and write-off rates must be like way higher than average, which they're not. Two, it must mean you are not deploying at like a rapid scale or like growing, which we've more than doubled our lending portfolio and our mentorship program in the last couple of years. And the other being that I think, frankly, after 3 years in this role, I just sort of accepted, like, I'm never going to be enough for everybody. I'm never going to make everybody happy, right? I tell all my new leaders this, like, once they hit a few months and they're like trying to do this, that, and I'm like,
Gonna happen.
never going to make everybody happy. You have to figure out, why are we here? What are we doing? Do you have courage in your mission and vision? And are we bringing our team along with us? I think how we try to balance that wanting to meet the need and the moment with not burning out the team or any one of ourselves, is also trying to have more open conversations, even if they're hard, about things like, a couple of years ago, we shared the article with our staff around Tema Okun's piece around the culture of white supremacy, right? Which is really hard for a lot of staff to read, because it inherently makes people feel like just because I'm white, I am being held to like white supremacy language. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, most of us, I would question, I think it wasn't until this job that I realized I had barely ever worked for a woman of color in my life. And that was 22 years before coming into this job. I don't know how many of you have ever worked for a woman of color. None of my staff had when I took this job. I think had one boss who was a fierce Haitian Creole woman for 1 year of my life in DC. And what does it mean for us each who have worked in organizations that have been status quo or whatever to do something differently that inherently has more of an anti-racist mission or vision towards it? We have to hold each other to, listen, like, I get that we want to do this, but we also don't want to create a sense of urgency that doesn't have to be this level of urgency right now, right? Like, there is this urgency in the market, in the community, in the need through pandemic, through lots of different waves of the pandemic. But how do we do this intentionally and bring more of our team with us? How do we break down our own levels of perfectionism, right? Because just going through all of the different elements of that article really sort of makes you think about how you show up, how you were raised, how you were trained. Honestly, for some of our staff, it started to unpack childhood trauma, and I know that sounds like a very Silicon Valley crunchy granola thing to talk about on a main stage, but being on this journey inherently makes you think through, how were you raised? How have you been trained to be professional and show up professionally? What are you then as a manager and leader passing on in the culture you are building for your team, right? Because if you are not doing your individual work, you are not going to show up for them better, nor are they going to show up for their teams better or clients and communities. So I think just building a culture, building that curriculum, building in not just the anti-racist learning, but also the psychological safety conversations, the trauma-informed coaching for our staff as well as for our entrepreneurs. I think that the two things combined really started to, and it's not easy, I'm not at all trying to portray that it has been, but I think the intentionality of that has built a different space.
So in our last remaining moments together, there are two things that I want to capture before we shift on to the rest of the day. So one is about the important lessons learned. Sort of what are you taking away, right, at this point? What have you learned? And that you would want to share with a room full of other CDFI leaders. And two, what's the call to action? So I'm going to throw it out there as a combined question so that we can make sure we cover everything. So Bobo, I'll come back to you. Lessons learned, call to action that you want other folks to walk away with.
I guess lessons learned, I would start with, I guess personally a big lesson learned for me is I don't know why, maybe I felt naive, but I never really realized coming from our board into this role how much being an immigrant, a woman of color, a first-time CEO would shape my journey in this role. Having grown up in an immigrant entrepreneur family, right, hustling, like we don't have friends and family capital, how do we raise it? To being an entrepreneur myself before taking this job, coming into this job, also what I was just sharing earlier in terms of never having had a leader of color in our organization before. I think lesson learned is, and maybe that's pertinent to my call to action as well, is have courage in your vision, be persistent, reach out to peers. I started to build a network of other first-time, particularly first-time BIPOC CEOs in our industry and in impact investing, because I just needed other people to be able to talk to who were going through this for the first time themselves. And I would say really think about sort of how are you redesigning for the communities that you are serving? How are you including their voices in the co-creation process? And how are you making sure your staff is really part of that journey with you to be that learning organization more holistically? I think that design and culture mindset combined is probably both a lesson learned and a bit of a call to action.
So I think I mentioned in a pre-conversation that what I learned is the pernicious tyranny of binary thinking. And it's not only in this space, right? Because it starts to, once you really hone in on that, you realize there's so many challenges that we have in running our organizations and in life in general, where we want to make everything black and white, yes, no, this or that. And this work cannot proceed without the ability to look at these things as a continuum, and to dissect through interrogation how we use that skill set. And if everything is approached in binary, and immediately it just goes there constantly, and it's not just the white staff or the people of color staff, I think it's a very human condition to pull it to that. It's either we throw it all out or we keep it, right? It's like, come on, guys. You're so much more talented than that when we break out of that. And so it's a constant work in progress, and I find myself consistently just falling right back into that binary space. And so we have to be really cognizant of that. I think that my call to action is, which was really when I gone through this deep training and sat there and really humbly and honestly reflected on, it's my 39th year in community development. The call to action is the very meaning of community development. How can we say we're in the community development business when people cannot authentically show up and be themselves in their community, in their workplace, in their lives? Whether it's capital, whether it's education, whether it's the justice system, what does community development mean without that? And so why we all have to fundamentally be in the anti-racist business in community development is one and the same. And so the call to action is, if you haven't felt anything in the last few years in the call, you got to really question, what does community development mean? What does community mean?
That's fair. So having gotten to that aspect of it, and I actually framed a question as a binary, right? Are CDFIs a movement or an industry? And I don't think there has to be a choice. But asking you to reflect on that a bit, right? Like, we've seen what's possible with collective action. We've seen what's possible, certainly in the last few years, where CDFIs have just been, right, at the focal point of how our resources moving, especially coming out of the pandemic and post George Floyd and racial reckoning. So what is the movement industry aspect of this, or the continuum? How do you think about that?
Yeah, it certainly isn't binary. I think that the industry side of this is, people of color want a good mortgage. They want to be serviced well. They want it at a low interest rate. They want all of those pieces. They just want access, right? So the industry side of this is incredibly important to try to produce that at scale. And so I tell my staff all the time, like, we have to be excellent as a provider of capital. That doesn't go away. And the more that we can standardize that can be standardized, in efficient ways, the more we can push to scale. And then none of this is meaningful if we are not beating the hell out of it through interrogation and reconstruction to have the outcomes so that we really have equity. And we are a long, long ways away. And so this movement the movement side of this requires us to get back to where we started, which is out of civil rights, and a vision for equity. So those two, to me, it is an absolute continuum. I don't want to give up on the industry side of this. I'm not a banker either. I'll go one up on you. I've never even had an accounting class. I just said that in front of, I'm sure, investors in the room.
I haven't either.
Bobo, last word is yours.
So I'm going to go binary on this. My grandfather marched for India's independence I started as a community organizer in DC. Interesting. You and I are going to go have drinks at some point.
We're new best friends.
I would actually posit that the term industry is a challenge for us to use because it puts you into industry mindset, right? Like the banking industry, the CDFI industry puts you into this mindset of feeling like there are inherited rules and terms you must follow because there is an industry way of doing things. I think that is completely the opposite of what we are supposed to be doing. And if you embody the fact that we were started out of the tail end of the civil rights movement, how are we fulfilling the agenda of that movement that has vastly been unfulfilled? We are the economic justice pillar of that movement, right? So how are we moving ourselves to fulfill the vision of that movement?
Thank you. Thank you all for being here this morning, and invite Seth.